This presentation is a summary of some casual analysis that I did over a cold weekend before COVID-19 that looked at two things. It looked at the pitfalls of a as the crow flies approach to designating school zones, but then also the challenges of trying to leverage more realistic school commute patterns using routing data sets. So with that out of the way, here in Greater Melbourne, most parents will send their child to the public school nearest to where they live, and nearest really being the key word here, and how we define nearest. Victorian government, they make both the public school data and the zoning data available through the data.vic open data portal, along with a really good application for finding out which school zone that you reside within. Here we have the primary schools in red within and around the Greater Melbourne region, and also their corresponding green school zones. If you live in that inner metro region, the designated school is typically going to be the nearest school defined as a straight line distance to that child's permanent residential address on weekdays. But as you get out into the outer suburbs and the outer urban and I guess kind of outer rural areas, that nearness actually switches from being a shortest distance, straight line, to actually being the shortest practical route being the key word there, by distance. And it's also route by distance, not route by time. There's actually a distinction there. I also want to point out that Victorian government, they do review these school zones annually, and they do actually make manual alignments to take into account, you can see here that they've traced along a river boundary or a highway, basically geographical barriers. But taking into account all geographical boundaries, and not just hard barriers, but also, you've got hard barriers like rivers and highways, private land, but you've also just got areas that you just wouldn't dream of crossing. Like you wouldn't want to walk, just across fields. You kind of want to stick to, paths through parks, sidewalks alongside roads. And there's actually a number of examples where the school zone that has been assigned, might well be the nearest from a straight line distance, but it's definitely not the easiest or the most accessible school for them to actually get to. In this particular news article, a child lived just 1 kilometre from their school, but between their school and between their home and the school was some wetlands, which meant they actually had to drive 10 kilometres past the neighbouring Seabrook Primary School in the next door neighbour's zone to then get back to their school in their zone. Here we have 4 schools and their 4 zones. Now these zones are, at the core, they're drawn up using Voronoi polygons. Voronoi polygons are created so that every point location is contained within one of these polygons, and it's then closer to that sample point in that polygon than any other point location. If you're in this particular polygon, the straight line distance nearest is that particular point, if that makes sense. So that's the school that's closest to you if you're in that polygon. Problem is, we're not crows and we can't fly in straight lines. We are grounded to the floor in the network that we can traverse along. If we take this single address point within this particular school zone, we can calculate a route to that designated school. And I know this area, and you have to go around a private golf course, down to that road, across the Merry Creek, across a bridge, and then back up to the school. And if we actually look at the other school, it's actually significantly quicker for this particular address to get to the other school, purely because it's more accessible given that road and path network. So let's just consider another approach. What happens if we decided to calculate for every single one of those purple address points, or what is the nearest school? We can perform what's called a batch origin destination matrix using the address points as origins and the schools as destinations. And then what this does is it utilizes a network data set. It's got information about the roads and the paths and the footpaths, but more importantly, it kind of knows, well, look, if you're a pedestrian and you're walking, these are the areas that you can walk. these are the areas that you can't walk. You can't walk across a highway. You can't walk along a highway. It's got all those kind of restrictions built into those data sets. That leaves you then with, for each of those individual address points, what is the nearest school, and it's been assigned to that. That school's been assigned to that address point. Essentially, which school each house walked to in the quickest time. And this result here is shown using a walking travel mode. And this is where it gets interesting, because the results might vary. If what happens if you were driving a car, you would be allowed on a highway then, and maybe the results different. What happens if you were riding a bike? Travel time shorter. And we'll come back to that, and how that was one of the challenges. Now, mesh blocks are the smallest geographical unit defined by our Australian Bureau of Statistics. They're commonly used in the commercial sector, like banks and retail, to sort of build up territories of around their stores and net branches. Likewise, we can use them as building blocks to make up some new school zones. For each of those mesh blocks, we want to know what is the dominant school that's been assigned. So all of the address points that are within one of those zones, what is the most frequently occurring assigned school, basically the mode, and we can use this to then perform a spatial join and calculate this layer. We can already start to see the boundary begins to differ to that original Voronoi polygon, and we can then take that a step further and dissolve that layer to then give us the new school zone layer based upon not a straight line distance, but an actual walking time to each of the schools. So let's have a look at what this looks like. So here is that layer, the red dots being the individual schools. And if we overlay, this is the 2019 green, the actual school zones for that particular year. And if we zoom in to the Melbourne inner metro kind of region, we can see for the most part they're very similar, which is a good thing, really. But it's a good thing if it kind of aligns to what you've been assigned. Like if you've been assigned something that's like, for instance, again, I live in this kind of area here. If you were down here, technically you're assigned to Spenceley Street Primary using the actual 2019 school zone. But I know that this particular road here is a very busy one with limited access points to get across it, and so does that routing data set. So these people in this residential area have actually been assigned using my approach to the Westgarth Primary, which I'd argue is actually probably the more accurate one to have picked for that. And you can see this in a number of places. Like if you zoom to any areas where there's private land or kind of parks that are or highways, you can start to see that the boundaries do differ along those kind of corridors. So this application is public, and you can take a look at it. If you're from Greater Melbourne, just tap in your address and see what it looks like in your area. It is important to note that this is using a walking travel mode, which you may or may not use walking to get to school. And I did sort of cross or have a think about, well, look, what happens if maybe in some of those outer urban areas, if the travel time is greater than 10 minutes walking, maybe switch to another travel mode like driving or incorporating public transport. But kind of blending them all together is quite a tricky process. Here is actually the raw mesh blocks, and we can see here, behind in the attributes, and this data set's open, although take it very much of a pinch of salt. Not only do we have the walking distance, but we have the walking time, and the same for public transport. So we've calculated what the average public transport time would be to get to these schools, along with the drive time as well. And you can see as you kind of go out into, this is kind of down towards Werribee, as you'd expect, as you kind of get further out of town, the walking distance kind of increases, whereas if you're in the more urban dense areas, that walking distance kind of shrinks down a bit. It's quite a good way of actually just understanding what the accessibility is like in your particular area, how public transport might change in different areas of the city. And it's interesting, sometimes even the drive time, maybe that's not a good idea in the inner metro areas, but in some of the outer areas it makes a bit more sense. These are just some of the extra kind of interim results that were created that are, I think, quite interesting to look at. So this is looking at not only do we care about the zone that was calculated, but also the travel time. So this is using walking, what is the travel time for each of these houses? So each of these dots is an address point. Haven't filtered out anything, so it is every address point. It's not just residential. And basically, if you're in the yellows to reds, you're kind of looking all right. But if you're a kid and you're in a blue spot, you've got a bit of a hike to get to school, and you probably wouldn't be walking. You'd probably be starting to consider asking mum and dad for a lift in the car, or getting on a school bus. Again, this could be quite useful to actually working out where to sort of prioritize school bus routes, maybe. Another way of looking at it, instead of looking at the address point, it's actually looking at the other way around and looking at it from the schools and say, well, look, from each of the schools, using the road network, what is the drive time from it? Therefore, if you're in the yellows to reds here, it's the same thing. It's kind of like if you live along these road segments, you're going to get to the school a lot quicker walking than you would do if you're on the blue segments. And you can see that some of these segments are actually grey. Either that's because they're outside of the cutoff of 20 minutes to get to these particular areas, or just sometimes it's because they are highways and areas where, because this is walking, that you're just not allowed to walk on. Sometimes it's actually in private parks and zoos and things like that. And then the last one, I'd probably like to spend more time looking at this, but public transport's obviously a very common way for kids to get to school. But with timetable data, it's not it's not a static data set. So here what we're seeing is 5-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute commutes to sort of getting to each of these schools. But that'll very much depend on when you leave your house. So if you leave your house at 6:30 versus 6:45, these accessibility regions will actually change depending on if you managed to catch that tram on time or if you missed it. So this is actually looking at a combination of you walking from your house to the tram stop or the bus stop or the train stop, and then also getting out and walking to the school at the other end, and understanding how that changes depending on what the timetables data is doing during that time. So when I personally went to school, I used to duck for a hole in the hedge, across another school soccer pitch, down a private road where there was another hole in the back of the fence to get into the school. And the point we're getting at is, if those paths aren't in the network data set, then the analysis won't take those types of routes into account. This particular example here, we have a school in the north and a highway, that kind of yellow line in the middle there, what we sort of see in the aerial image, the highway. And the purple line is my newly created school zone using walking times. So either side of that is 2 different zones. The problem is there's a footpath across this particular highway. You can see it quite clearly in the imagery. It's definitely a pedestrian bridge, but it wasn't in my network data set. So if I had that in my data set, it's quite likely that those houses to the south there would probably have actually been assigned to that school in the north, and the resulting boundary would probably be very different. And that was something that kind of I began to realize as well. The routing data, it's as good as the data that you put into it. And I did notice from this particular data set, it was just my bad luck. I forgot to kind of take the latest cut of data, and I do know that like here data is the best it gets for Australia, and the 2020 cut did actually include a lot more pedestrian walkway and path data, including that particular bridge. So the blue one is the later years cut. So I do plan on repeating this with this data set at some point. And then also OpenStreetMap has a wealth of paths and pedestrian data, and can also be a useful source for doing mainly walkability, accessibility studies, in my opinion. If you're looking at driving as a travel mode, the here data is usually the winner. It has a lot of that speed data, historical traffic data, even real-time traffic data that you kind of need to factor in when looking at anything like driving to work. But you can see here the coverage of OSM is pretty good, and sometimes it even has those extra sort of paths that might not be in a commercial data set, like maybe not through a hole in the hedge, but there is some trails out in the forests that technically aren't probably legit trails that are in OpenStreetMap. Another challenge was, the nearest school is measured not just in distance, but also by travel time. And when you're walking to school, I just defaulted to using the preferred walking speed of 5 kilometers per hour. But this speed might well be different depending on your child's age. Like it might need to be lowered if they've got shorter legs. but it might need to be maybe they even run to school, or they're probably quicker pace than 5 kilometers per hour if they're kind of in the teenage kind of age bracket. So if a decision is made that the walking should only be used for trips that are less than 20 minutes, for example, deciding what this walking speed is, as you can see here, does actually change what that result could look like. Now, instead of using mesh blocks, I briefly experimented with creating concave hulls around the address points and then the school that they're assigned to. And it wasn't until Simon O'Keefe from Ground Truth kind of put me on the right track with using mesh blocks. But I still liked this idea of using concave hulls. You could argue that it actually gives a truer outline of the school zones, but you do end up with these gaps and slivers and holes, basically where there's no address points. And mesh blocks is a much better idea. There's a reason why the commercial sector use them. It's a small enough geographical unit to kind of create these continuous zones without any gaps between them. Now, this isn't just limited to schools. If you think this approach has any merit, like a similar approach, or maybe a more advanced but kind of similar approach, could be applied to other scenarios. So here we have an existing fire station network across Brisbane. And same with schools. We can perform a batch origin destination analysis between the fire stations and every address point. This then gives us the travel time for every address point for the nearest fire truck to get to it. Each of those address points can also be assigned their nearest fire station. And maybe this is actually a dynamic. Maybe the nearest fire station is different if it's midnight versus 8 in the morning. So you can actually have different values depending on different times of day using some of that historical traffic data. And it wouldn't be, obviously, it wouldn't be a walking travel mode. From doing semi-related projects in this kind of field, you actually have a special travel mode specifically for a fire truck that weighs a certain amount, can only go above, through certain bridges and under certain tunnels, but also they can break some rules that we can't because it's an emergency situation. They can go above certain limits. They can do U-turns in certain areas where we can't. So you've got to have a special travel mode specifically for them. And again, not just fire stations, the same could apply for ambulances as well. Now, we also saw similar tools being run to assist in site selection when we were trying to work out where testing centres should be placed. Understanding, based upon the population, the residential address points, which testing centres are going to be nearest for each of those address points, and assuring that ideally we don't leave any gaps in those testing centre networks, particularly important in those greater populated areas like here in Melbourne. And then at the other end, hopefully the other end, looking at vaccination centres and hubs, ensuring that the supply of the vaccinations can be evenly distributed across the demand, the population, identifying areas where there might be longer travel times and plugging those holes of additional vaccination centres. So that concludes this presentation. The link at the top or the QR code there will take you to what we call an Esri Story Map that will kind of walk you through, similar to this presentation, but there's a lot of interactive maps that you can kind of play through and interact with and zoom around. Hope you found that of interest. Happy to answer any questions.